put in your testimony that the adversary's goal is not just to compromise the network, it is to use that compromise in furtherance of a larger objective. In this case, can you give us a sense of what we think that larger objective is or was?
Yes, Senator, thank you for the question. I think the intelligence community and the Unified Coordination Group that's coordinating the response to this incident has said in its public statements that we assess that the intent of the adversary behind this activity was for espionage purposes, to obtain information that would further their insight and their activities.
Do we have a sense, have other nations been targeted as well, or do we think that we were the only ones? For instance, is it possible that some of our European partners and allies could have been targeted and have yet not discovered it and don't know about it, or do we think that this was a standalone attack directed at the United States?
So based on what we've seen thus far, the majority of the activity appears to have been directed at the United States. However, we are aware of instances and information shared with us from foreign partners where some of their networks were affected as well.
That's interesting. I noticed that in February we also uncovered evidence of a separate parallel attack on Solarwinds software, but this time from a group of hackers in China. Do we think that this was coincidence, or was it coordinated? Is there anything you can tell us about the timing of this coming from what appears to be a different source?
What I can tell you is that some of the press reports about SolarWinds-related China-based activity were inaccurate. For me to go into those inaccuracies would require a classified setting.
Understood. Mr. Wales, just on this subject, let me ask you about one of the reports about these attacks. Some of the reports indicate that hackers targeted the National Finance Center. Sort of the processing of payroll information, or the center which processes payroll information for federal workers. And of course, you can imagine the compromise in personal data that would entail. What lessons, I'm wondering, should we take from that specifically? I mean, do we need to take further steps, for instance, to rethink how the government stores and protects personal data, especially of that kind?
So I'll say two things. First is that reporting was inaccurate. The National Financing Center was not targeted, as far as we know. And
at any time, not in first
or
second
as part
hack.
of this campaign or the separate campaign. And we've had a number of discussions with the U.S. Department of Agriculture that manages the National Finance Center. Do not believe that the NFC was targeted. But secondly, data loss prevention is one of the key capabilities that we are attempting to work through in Phase 3 and Phase 4 of our continuous diagnostics and mitigation program. Protecting sensitive government data is among the highest priorities we have, and it's certainly kind of on our roadmap for where we want to focus our efforts.
Let me ask you a adjacent question. You wrote in your testimony, Mr. Wales, that due to the global pandemic, the risk landscape has shifted dramatically over the past year. Can you give us a sense of why that's true? I mean, what's the difference? Is it more remote work? What's led to the threat environment?
The digital transformation that we went through, where there's much more significant remote work. Many workplaces have changed their operating environment. They're moving more to cloud-based infrastructure. And that movement has both strengths and weaknesses. In many cases, you're moving to an environment that's managed by professionals who can spend full time making sure that that is secure. But on the other hand, you need to make sure that you're doing it right, that you're configuring those systems. It introduces new vulnerabilities that your system administrators may not have had experience working with before. And so this change has increased and changed our risk calculus, and it's going to require the federal government to work with the private sector to adjust.
Just on the question of the vulnerabilities, the Wall Street Journal recently reported that some of the techniques used by the hackers were the digital equivalent of a spy's disguise. Can you give us a sense of how attackers can disguise themselves on government networks? I mean, what does that amount to?
I'm going to defer this one to Tanya. I believe this is more referring to them using U.S.-based infrastructure as opposed to operating from overseas.
That may be part of it. I mean, I think there are different ways that adversaries can try to blend into legitimate traffic. Some of that is by using, for example, virtual private networks, which might be carrying traffic not only from the malicious actors, but from legitimate actors as well. And Brandon also referred, I think in his testimony, to the fact that adversaries do try to use domestic infrastructure because it's more trusted by network defenders. And that's not surprising. Adversaries try to avoid detection by our services that focus on overseas collection, as well as the FBI, who collects here domestically, but we're always working very closely with our IC partners who are involved in both foreign collection as well as our focus on the domestic collection to try to close that gap and understand how the adversaries are trying to evade us.
Understood. Very good. Thank you all. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator Hawley. Senator Padilla, you are recognized for your questions.